Welcome to the Brain People Podcast, a show where four mental health experts team up to bring you practical tools for overcoming mental health challenges. The Brain People don't replace your doctor or therapist, but we will give you some extra tools to help you on your journey. So join us as we fight mental illness, one episode at a time.
Welcome, everyone, to the Brain People Podcast. My name is Dr. Katie Crews. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist, and I'm joined by
Amanda Anguish, and I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist.
And we are talking about people-pleasing.
Yes.
Now, we could start with a definition, but it's really something that we have to really describe more, right? Because if you look at just the words, you say, oh, people-pleasing, pleasing people. Isn't that good?
Yeah, it doesn't sound very bad.
No, not at all. So what are ways, maybe let's just start describing characteristics or examples so people start understanding what exactly people-pleasing is.
Yeah. So if you, maybe we could do a little quiz for our listeners. And
like a self-assessment?
Yeah, self-assessment. People love those. So I'll just ask some things or give you some examples and you try to figure out if you identify with these. So one would be do you say what you think other people expect rather than what you really think? Another one would be, do you give to others based on what you think they want versus what you genuinely want to give? Do you assess a room for other people's feelings at the risk of ignoring your own feelings or goals, or just even enjoying other people's company? Do you spend time worrying about what others think and feel and feel about them? And then, sorry, I'm losing it. I had to swallow there. Do you always apologize, or do you find yourself always apologizing even when whatever happened has nothing to do with you? That would be a good sign. These are all good signs that maybe you're a people pleaser.
Over apologizing.
Yes. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. One of my favorites is when maybe I've gone a little past the time for my therapy sessions and I go, ooh, I was totally in this. Our time is actually up and it was up a couple minutes ago or something. I need to let you go. And my client will say, oh, I'm sorry. And I say, no, I'm the keeper of the time. That's up to me. I was just enjoying the conversation or I was really into it. I just lost track of time. Or if they say, if I go, oh, that's sad or something, and they, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to tell you that. Like, is that hurting? And I say,
to
no.
burden you with my problems.
Yeah,
I'm like, that's my job.
Yes, I wouldn't be here if I wasn't okay with that. So those are the types of things that people who are people pleasers tend to say or do.
And I think these are good examples. When you're describing them, I thought of it's putting other people at this top place, and either you are lower or even just like not present. Like you were describing, you're not even thinking about what you want to say, what you want to give, what you think, what you feel. It's all about the other people.
Yeah, and we don't want to go to the opposite extreme where we only think about ourselves and don't think about other people. But I think maybe a good way of describing people pleasing is taking the extra burden of somebody else on yourself in relation to, instead of just being helpful or kind, I take the burden of all their emotions, of all of their responsibility on myself, in addition to all of my feelings and responsibility.
Because you value them so much more than you value yourself.
Or even how they perceive me more than I value what I perceive of myself.
Yeah. So why do we do this? And I always love this question because sometimes we immediately judge ourselves, and maybe some of our listeners they've done the self-assessment. They're like, oh no, I'm a people pleaser, or maybe they already knew it. And then we just judge, but it's important to understand the why, both to have compassion, but then also to address it.
Yeah. If we don't know why we do it, it's hard to do anything about it. And this is oftentimes the reason why we do people please is because maybe we have extra fear of abandonment. If I don't do these things, then maybe people won't value me or like me. Or we have a fear of failure. If I don't do this, like somehow failure isn't just a normal thing that humans experience, but it's extra, and I won't be able to handle that. Sometimes it happens because of conditional love that we've experienced as a child. And I say that because sometimes we have maybe parents or caretakers or people in our life who will say things like, well, if you hadn't done that, I wouldn't be so angry right now. Or if you.
So they've placed the burden on the child.
Yes, they've literally placed the burden on the child as though that child is responsible rather than recognizing that their child is learning and they're teaching them to take that responsibility versus, no, we're all responsible for our own emotions and how we respond to things. But it's a nice cop out if I don't want to feel bad about doing those things to say, well, you made me do this and it's your fault. And so it can be a manifestation of an unhealthy relationship with our parents or unhealthy relationship that the parents had with us. Another thing, and this goes hand in hand with that too, neglect or trauma as a child. Sometimes, we've talked about core beliefs in the past. I think you did a podcast on that. But when things happen, sometimes we assign a reason to it when we're younger, but we don't understand the full context of it or the ramifications of that belief. So we continue to believe that, well, it's my fault that my dad died when I was younger. And so we keep trying to do something as though we're going to make up for it or take that issue away if we just take more responsibility. And then neglect too. Sometimes if we haven't had healthy parents or parenting in our lives, and our parents maybe struggle with addiction or something like that, and they've been very neglectful, maybe their emotional issues have kept them, then we start to believe, we have these core beliefs that, well, maybe if I had done more, they would have responded differently to me, or they wouldn't have had their addiction, or whatever the case may be, if I was a better kid. And then we catapult ourselves into a lifestyle of, well, if I just do more, this person will accept me or be there for me.
And that's so damaging when the parent then actually responds in a positive way.
Yeah.
So I remember it's coming to mind of a patient long ago where she described that her father was an alcoholic. And she learned to scan the room. And she said, okay, how can I make daddy happy? And she learned that if I make him a drink, if I prepare a drink, he will congratulate me and say, oh, I love you, and praise her and so forth. And in that moment, she learned, oh, people pleasing. If I do something, they love me.
Yeah.
And so I thought, wow, that's such a clear example where a child in their naive thinking and their limited thinking learns something that's really actually true in that moment, although it's not actual love, but that gets reinforced. And so if that worked for my dad, it may work for other people.
Yeah, and I like that you use that word reinforced it, because we can learn things that aren't true, but if they're reinforced, then we believe that they're true. And so we keep doing that. And so what does that look like later? Well, maybe I'm in a relationship and that person's not healthy, but if I do something nice for them, they're actually treat me a little bit better than they normally would. And so I equate that. I've got this nice formula. Well, if Amanda does this, then this person will do that. And then I keep all of my boundaries are completely lost because I erroneously believe that that's the way to have a relationship when that person may not be the best for them, which I will get back to that one later too. So sometimes, and this is another side addition to that, we hyper focus on expectations of one unhealthy person. So I might be relatively healthy in other relationships in my life, but because I put such a high value on this one person in my life, I'm willing to do extra for them, to people please for them, even if I don't always people please with everyone else too.
And that goes hand in hand with the neglect and trauma because children prize their parents and caretakers.
Oh,
So
yeah.
they're willing to do anything. And a lot of times they are that unhealthy person or persons. And so if you hyper focus on what does dad or mom want, then that's going to be the foundation for all your future relationships.
Absolutely, for sure. And then the next one is guilt and shame. Sometimes we do things in our life. I often see this, especially with parents, maybe a single parent who has realized, I didn't make the best decisions. My child doesn't have the best other parent, or maybe I made some mistakes and they're in a deficient place in their life because of those mistakes that I made. So I'm constantly trying to make up for it, as though making up with video games or toys or, letting them do whatever they want is going to make up for whatever issue that I believe that or bad decision I made in the past. It's like carrying the guilt with us versus setting it down and saying, you know what, I'm going to make restitution for all of this, and then we're going to move forward from there. It's packaging the guilt up and carrying it through.
It's perpetual.
Yeah, it's a perpetual cycle. And then it makes it that much easier in other relationships to even take that guilt with us too. So the best thing to do for that is to set it aside. And then the last thing, and obviously there can be plenty of reasons, but they'll probably fall into these categories, a perception that we are a nicer or more Christian or even ladylike person if we do these things. We think, oh, well, that makes me a good Christian to constantly give and give and give. I'm living a life of selfless service. And I'll get back to why that's not necessarily a good idea too later.
And I often see that many of these just compound, and there's kind of a spectrum of people pleasing to minor to more severe. And I can think about the clients who maybe had a parent who's neglectful. Maybe they were also comparing siblings. And so they try to find ways that I can be loved more than my sibling. And then they had a Christian household or another religious belief system that was like, you give everything. And we don't realize in these different ways, it's also one of the reasons why I think we do this is we have low self-worth.
Yeah.
And it's sad because sometimes this can come from a good place of teaching that, yes, other people have worth. And as Christians, we do want to serve others.
Yeah.
But we also don't realize that we have worth and that we also need to receive, not just give.
Yeah. And that reminds me, I was speaking on modesty several years ago. It was an unusual situation where somebody said, "Hey, would you talk on modesty?" And I thought, "Oh man, that's
Want to do a podcast on that?"
Maybe we could. And as I was learning about modesty, I realized there's a parallel to humility with modesty. Most people, when they think of modesty, they think of how you dress. But modesty actually has a lot to do with humility. And humility is not just thinking of ourselves as lower, it's also not thinking of ourselves too highly. It's having a moderate view of ourselves. So we recognize our strengths, we recognize our weaknesses, but we don't value ourselves too high or too low. We value as who we are. And that's where modesty comes in, is then I act or I behave based on that value. And if we have a low value of ourselves, if we're not modest, I guess you could say, then we will start to overdo things. And then sometimes it creates burnout too, because can I people please as much as I think I'm supposed to with everyone?
So it's kind of like temperance in how we view ourselves results in temperance in what we do, including with people pleasing.
Yes. So then that comes into the side effects. So yes, that we already kind of see the side effects, which is people pleasing, but what are the side effects of people pleasing? One is people pleasing can make you appear like a great person and friend, but you often resent the burden and energy it takes. And I've seen this happen where people will tell me, like, everybody thinks that I'm so nice and so this and so that. But man, I just want to kill everyone because they keep asking for more and more.
Or they're
and
taking
more.
advantage of me.
Yeah, or nobody ever asks what I need. But what could be said of that is, have you ever let anybody know what you need? We're not all, have super magical powers to read each other's mind, even as, mental health practitioners. Sometimes we have to hear what somebody needs or where their limit is to know. Otherwise, sometimes it's just nice that somebody wants to do something and you don't want to tell them no if they're seemingly eager to do and help. So
And this is how the Boundaries book by Dr. Henry Cloud starts, by giving an example of this, because it's very common to hold resentment when we don't realize people pleasers condition people to respond in those ways.
yes. And I've had even friends who will say, "Why do these people keep asking me to do this?" And I say, "Well, have you told them that you can't? If you keep saying yes, you are conditioning them to keep asking." And when I used to do fundraising for a living before I became a therapist, go figure. I don't know if I've mentioned that, but one of the things that we learned is it's much easier to ask somebody who's already given than to go find somebody who's never given before and ask them. And so even sometimes people would say, "Why do you keep asking me?" And it's like, "Well, because you keep giving. And you're a ever-flowing fountain.
Yeah.
Of course we're going to do that." And that's not to necessarily be a bad thing in that case. But if people are doing something, you would just expect them to continue to do more of the same. Another one is, or another side effect of being a people pleaser is no one really knows who you are.
That's very true.
I like this. I found this quote by Anne Hathaway, go figure. "There's something very addictive about people pleasing. It's a thought pattern and a habit that feels really, really good until it becomes desperate."
It's true.
And when you're desperate, you're not being who you are. That's a fight or flight or a primal thing, sometimes people call it. It's not genuinely who you are. It's a survival place. It's not a place of being natural and who I really am.
It's like when we are desperate for food, right? We might be willing to get whatever food we want, and we might be anxiously trying to get the food versus actually coming from a place of what do I actually need, and
what's nutritious versus just what'll fill my belly right now.
And with people pleasing, you're getting, it's kind of what she's mentioning about it feels really, really good. Like, oh, I got the food, but then you realize it's not actually satisfying. And so it actually then also prevents you from being so hungry that you might actually pursue what you actually need.
Yeah. And what we need, I always like to say with boundaries, what's good for me is also good for the other person when it comes to boundaries. I never make a boundary that's only good for me. It's always going to be good for them and then ultimately good for the relationship too. Yeah. We'll get into that more later.
I was listening to a talk by Brene Brown, and she put it so beautifully, kind of talking about no one really knows who you are. She said the opposite of belonging, and your ears perk up like, oh, what is she going to say, is fitting in.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, and she goes on to explain, she says, fitting in is surveying the room, surveying the person, and trying to modify yourself, people pleasing, to fit to that person or to that environment. Versus belonging is, I am who I am, and as I demonstrate who I really am, then people accept me. And I thought that was so good because we think that they're often synonymous, right?
Yeah.
But we don't realize they are so opposing to one another. And that's why people pleasing gives us a sense, and that's kind of like addiction in general, of like it gives us a sense of what we're wanting, but it actually doesn't give us.
Yeah. And what you were talking about too is the law of attraction. We attract what is like us. So if I'm people pleasing, who am I likely to attract? Other people pleasers who get the same satisfaction out of saying,
takers,
perpetrators, takers, whatever you want to call them. I'm not going to attract necessarily really healthy people. But when I let go of the people pleasing, what happens is then I actually start attracting people who have the same qualities and values that I appreciate in myself too. And that's one of the greatest things when you stop trying to fit in. I think of it like you find your people.
Yes,
You know,
exactly.
your tribe or your people. It's this weird thing that happens. You're like, wow, I like that about that person. And then you start talking and then you realize, wow, we have this in common. Like you're like me. This is really cool. Like we can talk openly and honestly about what we like and stuff because we have those things in common. Another side effect of this too, is it leads to a lack of true intimacy, flaws and all. One of the most beautiful things, and I know we're both learning this as relatively newly married people, is one of the nicest things about being yourself is that you realize, oh, I don't have to be perfect for this person. I can actually show my flaws or my imperfections, and this person still accepts me just the way that I am. That doesn't mean we don't want to grow ever, but it means, wow, it feels really good not to have to put on a persona every time I'm around a person. And that persona keeps us from true intimacy. And true intimacy is that like bosom person that you spend time with, that you really like, I know you and you know me, like everything, and I'm accepted. And people pleasing never lets you get past the surface of a relationship.
And that's a true never.
Never, like literally never, if you don't put down the people pleasing. And the last one I added, this is kind of an asterisk, is one of the side effects is bipolar. Now, this is kind of a controversial one, but I'm going to make a case for it anyway. I have never met a bipolar person that doesn't have unhealthy boundaries with people. Meaning, and this is, please hear me out. I'm not saying that you're automatically bipolar if you're a people pleaser.
Yes, we do not want our listeners to
No.
now diagnose themselves.
And I'm not saying that you are a people pleaser and not bipolar because of this, but hear me out. When you're a people pleaser, there's this strange roller coaster thing that I watch people go through. And what it looks like is there's this huge increase and upward momentum when you're trying to please people. And you're bending over backwards, you're not sleeping, you're not taking care of yourself, you're looking at what everybody else needs. It's almost a mania. And not everybody notices it, but you start to feel the pressure building up and you're going and going and going. And you're on that high. You've got that high of like, oh, people like this, I'm being reinforced in all these behaviors. But how long are you able to keep that up? That's not sustainable. None of us can do that when it's not naturally who we are. It's not organic to us. And so what happens? Well, I find those same people, they've been in that little mania, I'll call it, not true mania. But then what happens? They start to crash. I can't keep this up. I can't keep doing everything that my kids want, my spouse wants, all of my friends, my church, whoever.
Or someone responds to them negatively,
yes.
And that like just destroys them.
And that can be the precipitating factor that causes the downward, the burnout, so to speak. And what do? They isolate. They go into hibernation. They start sleeping all the time. But then there's a point where it's like, well, I do want to be around people again. So then they do the upward pattern. And I see a lot of these people being diagnosed as bipolar, and they realize, oh, I'm doing this because I love the addiction of getting the approval and the pursuing the people's, because maybe I'm really good at it too. Like I'm really good at, and sometimes they'll call themselves empaths. Like I'm really good at picking up on people's feelings and I know how to deal with them and make them happy and soothe them and everything. But you can't do that. And so you go through that burnout stage, but it becomes a roller coaster throughout your life of just these ups and then these downs. And so I'm not saying that this is a true diagnosis, but sometimes I think people are diagnosed as maybe bipolar too, but they're not a true bipolar. They're just a people pleaser, and that's what their cycle looks like, up and down and up and down. So that's just my little,
I can see
I got
that.
a hypothesis there, and I'm going to go with it until I'm proven wrong. But I see this sort of manic pursuit of people's, happiness and taking care of them and getting the satisfaction of being good at it. But then they crash and they go into hibernation and they can't do it anymore because that is not sustainable, especially when that's not natural to you.
And I'll just add to that. Sometimes people do that within Christianity, where they do a lot of ministry, a lot of projects, a lot of things, and then they don't get that reinforcement, that validation from others, or even from God, or something happens negatively where they say, oh, well, why God? And then they just plummet. And it just keeps on going in this roller coaster of either people pleasing for people in the church or people pleasing for God.
Yeah. And what's the expectation? You and I both talk about beliefs and thinking and everything. There's an underlying assumption that if I just do enough, I will get what I think I should get out of this. That's why we people please, because it's actually kind of pleasing ourselves to please others. And so, what happens when I do everything in my power, I think, to please this person, and I don't get back what I think I'm supposed to? Well, now that shatters me.
Amanda, you just said something like super casually and just kind of kept on going. But I think it's a very important point that people pleasers don't really do it for others. They do it for themselves. And I remember reading something from Dr. Henry Cloud that talked about this in regards to boundaries. And I didn't realize it's kind of this paradox where they take on the burden of other people's emotions and so forth, acting as if they're completely weak and helpless and it's all about the other person. But when you really think about it, it's for them, and they actually have this skewed mentality that they have the power to be responsible for other people's thoughts, emotions, and so forth. And so it's just this very interesting, and I haven't even fully wrapped my head around it, just this paradox of people pleasing and taking on other people's emotions, where it comes from an insecurity, but it's also to some degree an inflated sense of self.
Yeah, it's kind of like a savior complex. My job is to go around the world, not literally, but whatever environment I'm in, and to rescue this person and please this person and please that person. When in reality, was that ever my job? Was I ever given that? Is that a God-given thing to do?
I cannot do all things for all people.
I can't. I literally can't. And so, yeah, that's a good thing to think about and it reminds me of a quote. I might have even mentioned it in one of our previous podcasts, but there's a quote by Charles Spurgeon in one of his great sermons where he said, I say that everyone is right, so to speak, because I'm choosing a soft path for my own feet. If I never say anything that creates conflict, if I never say anything that's true at the risk of offending my brother or sister, then I'm actually just making a soft path for my own feet. I'm only thinking about what makes me feel good. And so people pleasing isn't often just about pleasing others. Sometimes it's about pleasing myself too, because it makes a soft path for me, because then I don't have to deal with any ruffled feathers.
And I think it's important, we're not saying this as, out of a judgment, but it's one of those things that we need to look in the mirror and have that sobering moment of, am I struggling with either insecurities, or am I having an inflated sense of self that I think this, and I don't even maybe realize that I think this, but my actions are demonstrating kind of what's in my heart.
And, none of us truly knows our hearts, but it's good to be mindful every once in a while to just consider, like, what am I really doing this for? Why is this really because I think I'm helping somebody, or is it because it just takes away the anxiety that I'm building up right now? And I think far too many times we do things because of anxiety buildup, just to release like a volcano, rather than, wow, is this actually going to help?
Yeah, it's kind of giving me some flavors of like OCD, like these compulsions that we have, some elements of addiction, right, where we try to numb that anxiety through a substance or behavior. And these things overlap, but we have to realize it doesn't actually do what it's promising to do. And so
Yeah.
we need to find something else to do. And I think that leads well to, well, how do I overcome this? Because we don't want to
Yes.
leave people in despair of like, oh no, I'm a people pleaser. Maybe I'm doing this for myself. I feel terrible about myself. What do I do, Amanda?
Yeah. Well, I like that you said that because that's never our intention to just make you feel bad and then go, well, deal with it now. You're a bad person. That's not what we're saying at all. One of the ways that can help us overcome being a people pleaser is just understanding how your brain works. Our brains, I heard Mel Robbins say this. I like the way she says it. Our brains are hardwired to both protect us and to keep us comfortable. And far too often, as we were talking about, that's why I'm a people pleaser, because I'm trying to protect myself from hurt. Maybe I've been traumatized and I don't want to deal with that conflict or that hurt or that pain. But also, it's to keep myself comfortable too. And so just understanding that your brain is not the only one who does that, or the brain that does that, but all of our brains are doing that. That's like the basest thing that our brains want to do, is to protect us and keep us comfortable. So just knowing that means, oh, okay, so I'm not actually that different, even though I'm listening to it too much versus not. Another thing that we can do is write a list of values, because often we spend so much time focused on what other people need and want that we never truly consider, well, what is important to me? And that can be things like, what do I believe about family? I might be trying to please everybody at work, but I'm not considering what pleases my family at home, or I'm constantly going back and forth between those two things. So just considering what's important to me in terms of family, friendships, even health. If I value my health, is it helping me to stay up all night trying to please somebody and not getting rest? Because how helpful am I going to be to the next person if my health isn't good? And this is one of the things I've had to consider more and more, is that I do value my health. And part of that health means sleeping. And if I love getting good sleep. So if I'm not getting at least 7 hours of sleep, I know my body, I need at least 7 hours. That's like my minimum. I don't function very well. So if I don't say no to some things, then I can't get that sleep, which means I can say yes to the other things that are important to me. Also eating and setting aside time for those sorts of things. Setting aside time to actually go get good, healthy food versus just what's available right here and right now. So those are some things, but other things like money, some people please so much, they're buying people stuff
That's
all
true.
the time. That's actually been one thing that I've considered, because I know there are some people in my life who are people pleasers, and they have actually given me things. And then I feel compelled to buy them something to respond. And then it could become this vicious cycle where we're just giving and giving. And I realize I'm just not going to give a gift back. And then what do you know? They stop giving me gifts. And so that's just an interesting one. And another one is identity. I know you're going to talk about that in a podcast. And then even intelligence, spiritual beliefs, self-respect. I like this quote, don't set yourself on fire hoping others will get warm.
Yeah.
That'll be one fire and then it'll be done. So we do have to consider, what are our values?
I love that, because it's taking a step back from the people pleasing and trying to have a bigger perspective.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, I'm just caught up in the people pleasing. What we're asking is like, okay, step back, understand how your brain works, and then saying, okay, what really matters in life? Yeah, I would like for people to be happy around me, but what are my values? So I love that. I'm just kind of imagining in my own head of like having people take a step back from the people pleasing, just put it on pause, just start telling everyone no for a moment.
Yeah.
And then just really reflect, is this the life that I want to live? I did this with a client recently. I'm like, do you really want, this is the pattern of your life with people pleasing. Do you really want this 10 years from now, 20 years from now? And when people have that perspective, And then they start reflecting on, no, I want my values. I want to live those out. I want my family to be, I want to have good time with my family and have a good job and so forth. I don't want to be broke.
Yeah.
Like really think it through. Because what happens with addictions is we do it for the moment, but we don't have a long-term perspective. So I really love the question of values.
Yeah. And the long-term perspective too is, what do I want to be? Not just do I want to keep doing this, but what do I want to be like in 10 years or 5 years or even next month? Do I want to feel like this?
Do I want, yes, people to be pleased? And with that, burnout, depression, anxiety, probably not. And so do I want to live out these values in my life?
One thing that you mentioned, saying no, I think sometimes that's a really hard thing to swallow. Like, I have to say no. And I like to encourage people, you don't actually necessarily have to say no right away. You can buy some time.
Let me check with my husband.
Yes. And so I have that. One of the things that I tell people, if you're used to saying yes all the time because you feel this, anxiety in you to just hurry up and give an answer, you don't have to say yes and you don't have to say no.
Put some space.
Put some space
really
to
good.
give you
It's very
time
practical.
to go back to your values to see what really is important to you. Because sometimes I don't think about everything on the fly. I'm not good at processing things, well, at least everything, right in a moment. Sometimes I have to buy myself some time. And so to buy myself some time, I can say things like, let me get back to you on that. Give me some time to think about it. Let me talk to my spouse about it. That makes you look really conscientious of others' feelings, which goes back to values too. Or, let me pray about this before I give you an answer. I love it when people tell me that. I'm like, wow, then that means that they're really going to be invested in this if they feel the presence of God in it too.
You do need to come back to it because this has come up recently where someone's like, let me think about it. And then they started having a reputation of they're always thinking about it. I never hear back from them. But another one is, and I've done this before, is I've actually said it out loud I have a tendency to say yes to too many things. And so I'm really practicing to either, if you already know it's a no, say no, or I'm practicing to actually think about it and actually see if I can do it. So I will check and I will get back to you. But sometimes it's just saying that out loud of I have a tendency to say yes, or I have a tendency to overcommit, or I love doing things for people and I just got to make sure that, I'm taking care of my other things as well.
And that gives other people permission too.
It does. It'll change
to be
the overall
vulnerable.
culture, I think. Because this is not just individuals. Sometimes we live in societies or cultures, and I do think today where we're overly busy, we have a culture of just saying yes to people.
Yeah, I've had clients, I love it when they say to me, how did you do that? All I did was say, no, I can't do that now, or something. How did you do that? How do I do that too? I say, well, you have to say no to some things until it doesn't mean I feel good all the time about saying no, but if I don't say no, I'll never say no to things.
And I don't know if you have it on here, but one thing that I tell clients that struggle with people pleasing is I have them just pause for a moment and actually think about it. It is impossible for you to do all things because people pleasing is sometimes also related to perfectionism.
Yes.
Where they think they can do 100% into all the things that everyone asks for them. And so just pausing for a moment and realizing I actually cannot say yes to everything. So what ends up happening is I say yes to everything, but I actually cannot follow through. And so I end up saying no without saying no to things that then matter. And then I get resentful. So instead, you actually need to recognize, why not be intentional about saying yes and no versus forcing life to say no for me?
And with that question of, can I literally do everything, is the question, can I actually please everyone?
Exactly.
How tall of an order is that?
Maybe even write it down. This is what my mom asked for me. This is what my dad, my boss, write it all out and be like, is it physically possible while sleeping, while, having the bare necessities? And it's not.
There's no way to do everything that you're ever asked to, nor should you. Some things aren't even worthy of doing. So we do have to ask that. That kind of goes into another one, which is one of the ways to do this is to have boundaries and then also consequences when people break those boundaries. But I like this question a lot because I think so often we think we're pleasing people when we're actually not. So the question is, am I really helping this person or just making easier
That's
for
really
me?
good.
Because so often when I see somebody struggling, I'm not helping them necessarily when I go and rush in to rescue them. So often what I'm actually doing is just getting rid of the anxiety that I'm building up inside watching them struggle. And struggling isn't bad. One of the best examples of a healthy struggle is when you watch a chick try to break out of its shell. You don't see the mama bird start pecking away and doing the job for the chick because some of us know that it's very important for that chick to build up the muscles of chipping out of that shell. And if they don't do that, they're not going to be able to handle the world beyond that shell. And so if they don't build those muscles up, they can't handle it. And so often when we try to please people, we're forgetting the long-term consequences for the moment consequences of it. Like, yeah, they're going to struggle, but what comes out of that struggle for this person? It could be your kids with their homework. It could be whatever the case may be. What happens if I let this person struggle and I don't rush in to rescue them? Do they build muscles, emotional muscles, mental muscles, physical muscles? Do they just become more independent human beings if I don't rush in and rescue them? So am I sacrificing the long term for the short term?
And many times it's not just like, is it helping, but a lot of times we enable people by pleasing. And so I love the quote, and maybe I've said it before too. You start doing enough podcasts that you don't remember what you say, but givers need to set boundaries because takers never do.
Yep.
And sometimes we don't realize that when I do something, it's not just potentially, whether it's for me or am I helping, but am I actually doing active harm by enabling, in this case, a taker, or in other cases, something else?
And sometimes takers aren't like narcissists, selfish, like cruel people. Takers are people that have just never been told they can do something.
We're told no.
And they just take. It's like a baby chick. I'll go back to the chick example. If you just keep feeding them forever, are they ever going to leave the nest? No, you have to teach them like, hey, it's your turn to fly now. This is your job. You get to go out and get things for yourself. And then the dopamine that comes from that is wonderful. So you're actually taking the joy from other people of learning how to do those things on their own, too.
I like that. That's a practical step of reframing instead of people pleasing, like I'm helping them. You reframe that to, one, I'm hurting them, and then reframing the opposite of, by me saying no, I may be helping these individuals either do it themselves or find someone else. That actually happened with a client of mine recently where she said no to her son to take care of the grandchildren. And because of that, he started looking for other people. And then he found a friend that's actually more local that could take care of the kids. And they're like, it works out beautifully. Yeah. But if we clip people's wings, right, we don't actually push them to be resourceful on their own by people pleasing, they may never grow. So we're doing them a favor. I like
and
that.
another question too is, am I the one responsible for this?
Yeah.
Can you imagine if I'm a nurse in a hospital and I keep doing the surgeon's job for them? Like I might, the surgeon doesn't have to do their job anymore, but who's really responsible for this?
Not only that, but if you're doing the surgeon's job and you're not qualified, but you're just the anxiety of people pleasing, then you get blamed. And this is where people pleasers are like, what? I do so much and then I get heat.
Yeah.
Well, you're not qualified
That's
or
not your
capable, or
job
it's
to
just
do
not
it.
your job.
I see this in the group that I run sometimes, where people in my group, I try to tell them, but they can't help themselves sometimes, where somebody's having a hard time and another person in the group who's already struggling with their own stuff tries to jump in and rescue that person. And I'm like, oh no, they don't know this person's whole story. And what they're doing is actually keeping this person from getting better. But because they have a limited perspective and they're empathizing too much with their struggle, they think that they're actually helping. And so it's like, well, let me do my job and I can actually help the person because I know more about what they need. And otherwise, you're actually going to sabotage the work that could happen in this person's life. So consider, whose job is this actually? I don't need to jump in.
Yeah.
And then the last thing that, second to last thing, understand other people's emotions are their own.
Yes.
We
That's kind of
all
like it's not your job.
yeah, it's not my job. It's my job to handle my emotions. It's your job to handle your
You
emotions.
can't handle my emotions, Amanda?
Only to a certain degree. No, your emotions would be a lot easier to handle.
But yes, I am responsible for my emotions.
Yes.
Every single person is responsible for their own.
And sometimes what that means too, I like sometimes my husband and I, when we're dealing with something, I love when I hear him say, and I'll ask like, oh, are you okay or something? And he'll be like, yeah, I'm figuring this out. I have to figure this out right now. And I'm tempted to take that on and go, oh, well, maybe I did something wrong. I need to figure it out. But he's realizing, no, I need to figure this out because my emotions aren't in the place that they need to be. So I need to take care of this.
Yeah.
And so
And what you just highlighted is you're like, oh, is this something that I did? What this actually does when we think that we're responsible for others' emotions is we actually just double the problem.
yes.
Because if you can't really resolve it for your husband, but then you take it on yourself as if you could, then you just added your own emotions to it, which are not necessary.
And it's quite freeing when he says that. I'm like, oh, good.
Yeah.
I know you may not have the feelings that you want to right now, but you're taking them on yourself and not making me, which I'm not going to necessarily do anyway, but it's nice to hear him say that. So we can do that too sometimes, is go, oh, well, if my emotions are my responsibility to work out, they're not somebody else's, then maybe their emotions are their responsibility to work out.
Emotional
too.
boundaries.
Yes.
Right? What's on my property versus what's on your property.
Yeah. And then the last one, do hard things. Sometimes we want to avoid stuff and we don't want to deal with our feelings and we want to rush and get involved in other things, but sit down sometimes and realize that I'm just going to take care of the stuff that I have here to do. I'm not going to get involved in other people's stuff. And that in and of itself is a hard thing to do sometimes.
Because you're sitting in the anxiety that we were talking about, that we typically want to scratch that itch.
But when you sit in the anxiety, you start to recognize the irrational beliefs that you're having. If you try to go out and get rid of those feelings, then what you might wind up doing is reinforcing the belief in the first place, not realizing that the belief wasn't a healthy one to have.
So in some ways, exposure therapy, right, doing the opposite, in DBT we call it opposite action for people pleasing, would be start saying no, even if you don't fully believe it yet, even if your beliefs haven't been fully changed. But while you sit in the anxiety and realize, hey, people can still love me even if I don't do anything for them, I feel so much better and not, desperate. And then you start realizing over time, wow, this is a better life for me.
And there's always that moment where it's difficult until it's not so difficult anymore. And that's the hard thing, is like, am I willing to sit with this feeling, this frustration, this anxiety until I see that maybe there's another way on the other side of it? I like this quote. We can end with it. The man who seeks to please God is the man who people are pleased with. So the man who seeks to please God is the man who people are pleased with. The man who seeks to please others won't satisfy anyone. And that's by Edwin Lewis Cole. And I always like to tell people the only person you have to be a people pleaser with is God. If you please him, you don't have to worry about anyone else. You will please the right people. You won't please the wrong people, but he's ultimately who we want to please. And that's how Jesus lived, to be a God pleaser, not a people pleaser.
And he's easy to please if we
Yes.
understand actually the right way to please. He doesn't ask for doing and finding our value through our works.
Yes.
And so I just encourage people with the caveat of like, make sure you understand how God actually wants to be pleased.
Yeah.
It's not as human love does. It's not conditional.
Yes.
It's what he's already done so much for us. That's why it's easy to please him by just saying yes to that.
And some of the things that please God are just talking to him, just spending time with him. Those are things that please him. Just having that
Showing up as you are.
that companionship with God, that pleases him. And then the more you spend time with him, you understand that, oh, wow, he's not that hard to please, or he's not hard to please at all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Amanda. This was
Yeah.
awesome. And just as an encouragement to our listeners, to one, if you're struggling with this, apply some of the things we talked about. But also if you know someone, probably not so directly, but like, hey, here's this podcast on people pleasing, but please do share. People want to be educated and more aware so that we can all help each other to live more helpful lives and just more wholesome lives, and not desperately seeking to please one another, but being satisfied. Alrighty, well, we'll see you next time. Take care. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please like and subscribe. Your engagement will help us reach more people who need encouragement. To hear more episodes, learn about our other mental health resources, or support us financially, visit thebrainpeoplepodcast.com.